Welcome to In Conversation with David Frum. I'm your host, Sean Speer, editor-at-large at The Hub. I'm grateful to be back in conversation with David for another installment of our weekly video and podcast series on the key issues concerning Canadian policy and politics. In today's conversation, we'll cover three topics. First, the ongoing constitutional crisis in the United States over the Trump administration's deportation policy and a particularly high-profile case. Second, the ongoing fallout from Trump's tariff threats towards Canada and how they're influencing Canada's own economic policy debates. And third and last, new polling that shows the growing MAGA-fication of the Republican Party. David, thanks as always for joining us.
Thank you.
David, there's been a lot of talk over the past several years about Donald Trump and the extent to which he represents a trend towards authoritarianism and fascism. I admit that I've resisted that kind of language. It struck me as a bit of hyperbole, perhaps more obscuring than clarifying. But this particular case in recent days involving the extradition of someone into El Salvador based on an administrative error and the administration's refusal in reaction to a series of court decisions that it ought to take steps to bring this person back to the United States strikes me as the clearest case of authoritarianism, or at least an unconstrained executive that we've seen. Why don't you just reflect on it and its significance in your mind?
Well, I don't think it's the clearest case. I think Trump's attempt to violently overthrow the election of 2020 and install himself as president in despite of losing the election, that remains, I think, the single most dramatic dramatic episode of defiance of law, and then his subsequent pardons of his co-conspirators and his now proposals to pay them money. Those all strike as attacks on the constitutional foundation. In the first term, there were lots of attacks on the constitutional order. Some of them sputtered out because the courts would not go along. But Trump has always made it clear he's not bound by law. And the Supreme Court of the United States gave him a boost when it then said, it answered a question that had just never come up before in American history, which is, to what extent can the president be held criminally liable for things he did as president? That's just not a question that the courts have ever had to answer before because, of course, presidents didn't do criminal things. Donald Trump did, and they gave him wide-ranging immunity, thinking, I believe, they were solving a constitutional problem, not seeing that with a character like this, they were opening the way to a much bigger problem. So now here we are with these deportations. Now, background. Deportation hearings are not usually heard before an Article 3 judge. That is the kind of judge who's selected by the president, confirmed independently by Congress one by one, whether they're on the Supreme Court, the appellate courts, or the district courts. Deportation hearings are heard by a special category of magistrate who is not usually Senate confirmed, and the hearings are very expedited. And there's some process. You get a chance to show you've got the wrong person or I have some colorable claim. But the basic theory of immigration law is you're not being deprived of life, liberty, or property. You're a person who is in the United States without status. You're being sent back to the country of which you are a citizen. And you remain a free person. You have a temporary deprivation of freedom in that interval between when you're told you have to leave the United States and you're going to be under supervision until you're out of the United States. But once back in your homeland, you are free as any other citizen of that homeland. So the process has been an expedited one. And every year, tens of thousands of people are removed in this way. More were removed, I think, under the Obama presidency than have been removed in this way under the Trump presidency.
Yes.
Trump has instituted something new, which is he's not just removing people from the country. He's removing them and sending them to a prison in a country where many of them have no contact at all. The prison is El Salvador. Many of the people being removed are Venezuelan, and they're being sent to a prison with no hearing of any kind, no showing of any kind of guilt of any crime. The prison holds people for life, and the United States government cannot wash its hands because the United States government is paying millions of dollars a year. They say six, but again, that's not a corroborated figure. They're paying millions of dollars a year to the government of El Salvador to hold people for life without a hearing at the demand of the American president. That's a different kind of thing from saying, sorry, you don't have a right to be in the United States. Go back to wherever you do have a right to be. Um, that is saying we are going to seize people in the United States who we don't prove them of anything wrong, they've done anything wrong, and send them to a brutal prison in a foreign land, where many of them, by the way, die because of the inhumane conditions in the prison. They're not. I don't think anyone's been murdered yet, so far as we know, but people die of neglect and disease and under overcrowded and unhealthy conditions. This United States Supreme Court has said, with this one man who's a native of El Salvador, was in the United States illegally, but who was given a withholding certificate. That is, a judge, an immigration judge, said, you can't remove this man just yet. He has more. He has a colorable claim that he's in danger if he goes back to El Salvador. So you can't remove him without further process. Trump ignored the process, accused him of all kinds of crimes based on evidence that is extremely flimsy and suspicious. The evidence all came from a police officer who was later removed from the force for his own genuine criminal activity. And this man is in a prison. And Trump is refusing, and the United States is paying for it, and Trump is refusing a unanimous order of the Supreme Court to facilitate the exit of the man from the prison. And there are other cases that are going through the Article 3 courts about the Venezuelans, many of whom look, if not outright innocent, certainly that no proven wrong, and they're in a prison, and a horrible prison. Not that they're nice prisons.
Well, I take your point, David, that there have been a number of offenses to the Constitution under the Trump administration. I didn't want to diminish those, but the reason I said that this one seems particularly significant is that I think a lot of people, including myself, have told ourselves a story that, notwithstanding Trump's own excesses and ambitions, that the system has mostly held up till now, that the checks and balances, including, of course, the Supreme Court, has placed constraints around him. You get the sense that Trump and others in the administration see this case as not just about this particular individual, but a much more fundamental showdown about the inherent limits of the presidency vis-a-vis the courts. And in that sense, it strikes me as significant. What would you say to that?
Well, Trump has said aloud or speculated about loud about that actually American citizens might be sent to these courts in El Salvador, these prisons in El Salvador. And he's hazy about whether they get a trial first. Presumably they have to, but they would then be sent to a foreign prison. He's speculated about that. I think you're right that many of the checks and balances held during Trump 1, but understand that one of the reasons they held was because the courts kept out of his way. I think the courts had an intuition that Trump would not obey them. And so they gave him a lot more leeway than they've given other presidents. And you saw that with very much the questions about such questions as, well, the 14th Amendment says that if you engage in insurrection, can you are not supposed to be on the ballot ever again. And the courts just use delay. They said, we don't want to, we're confronting these agonizing problems. We don't want to get mixed up. We are hoping that Trump will lose the 2024 election. So we're just going to keep out of his way and not exert our authority. I think that's what was going on with the question about the president's criminal liability, with other questions. They used delay as a way to hope that they wouldn't have to say something to him that he wouldn't like, because they don't trust him to obey their orders. And so to preserve their own authority, they've not issued him an order that he would disobey. But that's been very much about the Roberts Supreme Court overwhelming concern with self-preservation rather than the preservation of the system. They are much more worried about their own credibility than the system as a whole. In this case, yes, we do seem to be heading to outright defiance, and there are going to be others. So there are other instances of multi-branch comedy. So that of arrangements that were sort of semi-constitutional that have broken down. One of them is the United States has all of these independent agencies. And the theory of the independent agent, we'll often say by statute or by convention that some people on the agency will be appointed by the president, some will be appointed by Congress. There's an understanding that they will be bipartisan, some Democrats, some Republicans, and there's an understanding that unless they're caught fiddling the expenses, they're not going to be removed before the end of their term. The president theoretically, the president can remove them, but the understanding is the president's only going to remove them for a big reason. And then there's certain jobs where this has been the practice. The FBI director, the FBI director is only supposed to be removed for a big reason. And the one FBI director who was removed before Trump came on the scene was an FBI director removed by President Clinton because of accusations of fiddling the expenses that were filed by the Bush administration before Clinton. So the Bush administration had this report on the way out the door. They left the recommendation to Clinton that the director be fired for fiddling the expenses. And the Clinton people then spent months trying to pressure the director into resigning voluntarily so they wouldn't have to do this. Trump fired 2 FBI directors. And it now is very plausible that he's on his way to firing or trying to fire a Federal Reserve chairman. And again,
Yes.
can he do it? Presidents have never done it before. Trump is not just ignoring judicial authority, but he's also breaking understandings with Congress about the way the president and the Congress would cohabit.
Yeah, a ton of insight, David. This will be an issue that we continue to follow. One of the virtues of shifting our conversations from bi-weekly to weekly is that we can continue to track them, and I'm grateful for your wisdom. Let's transition the conversation, if you'll permit me. In addition to speaking with me each week, you're now moonlighting as your own podcast host. Congratulations for the launch of the David Frum Show.
I feel like Rhoda, who's been spun off from the Mary Tyler Moore Show and is going to try to do it on her own instead of being a subordinate cast member.
And just this week, in fact, today, April 16th, you released the second episode. I'd encourage people to check it out. They can find it on YouTube and other podcast platforms, in which you speak with Ontario Premier Doug Ford about, amongst other issues, how the Ford government is thinking about Canadian economic policy in the face of Trump's threats and provocations. It reflects a broader subject that you and I have talked a lot about, including last week in Toronto, and that is the risk that Canadian business leaders and policymakers use the Trump administration's step back from free trade to themselves embrace protectionism and statism and all the rest. Why don't you just reflect on your conversation with Frum and some of these bigger intellectual developments manifesting themselves in Canadian politics?
Well, Premier Ford, who was very gracious, came on the podcast. It was very interesting, and I tried to encourage him to help Americans understand how Canadians feel about what has happened, not just the facts and figures about how involved the two countries are. But he said one thing that made my ears pick up, that reflected on our conversations online and offline. He talked about how Canada is, of course, an aluminum superpower because of cheap and abundant hydroelectricity, which is a very important ingredient in making aluminum. Canadian aluminum is cheaper than American, it holds a huge part of the American market, and Trump has put on tariffs to try to bar Canadian aluminum from the U.S. market. America produces about 20% of the aluminum it uses. So this is a futile and self-harming act, and Canadians are understandably aggrieved. Because again, just as the American aluminum industry is not big enough to meet American needs, the Canadian aluminum industry is much bigger than Canada needs, and it makes its living by exporting to the United States, where aluminum is used for so many products. So President Premier Ford mentioned, well, we're thinking not just about exporting in this world we can no longer export aluminum. Maybe Canada should make its own aluminum cans. Canadians tend not to do that. The aluminum is exported and the cans come back, often wrapped around beverages that are made in the United States. And if the issue here is that Canadian entrepreneurs have not organized themselves to make cans in Canada, and that in this crisis there's a genuine market opportunity for the creation of a Canadian aluminum can industry, and maybe that industry needs some incubation, then that's the kind of thing that provincial governments do. But what I worry about is it means the Canadians are thinking as they used to think back in the 1970s. If you produce a raw material efficiently in Canada, there are more jobs to be had by going up the value chain, even if you do so in a way that isn't economically efficient. And you should somehow try through government allocation of capital, through various kinds of protectionism, to get those up the value chain jobs in Canada by non-market means. And Canada's experimented with this. I mean, it's not a thing to discuss in the abstract. Would it be better to use government subsidy and trap capital to go up the value chain? Canada's tried it, and it doesn't work. It does produce jobs, but as Milton Friedman say, you want to produce a lot of jobs, ban farm machinery.
Yeah.
The idea is not just to create, yeah, we can all go back to, there are lots of jobs in subsistence agriculture. Um, the point is not to create jobs, is to create jobs that pay well, and the jobs that pay well in real money that can buy more and more goods and services all the time. And that, if that's your goal, not only more jobs that pay well and pay more than the increase in the price of goods, then this state incentive to go up the value chain is a big mistake. Now, again, no qualm if Canadian entrepreneurs need a little bit of a nudge to try some new opportunities and they seize the moment. No qualms about that. But if the idea, and you're hearing more and more talk of this in Canadian circles, about going back to the import substitution of the 70s, to trapping capital in Canada, requiring pension funds or registered retirement savings plans to keep more of their capital in Canada, and then making cheap capital that can be used for made in Canada jobs. This is a very dangerous path. It's been tried
Yeah.
before. It's failed before.
Yeah, well said. And to your point, David, this is hardly the monopoly of one party. Doug Ford may be talking about a made in Canada aluminum can. Mark Carney's on the election campaign federally talking about a made in Canada car. And I was at a session this week with business leaders who were similarly making the case for why their particular industries require particular protections and supports and so on in this so-called new world. One gets the sense that there is something of a race to the bottom here, where
Yeah.
we risk kind of relearning the lessons of the past.
Well, a great and vivid writer about trade who lived a long time ago, Henry George, has a arresting metaphor. He said, to introduce a tariff bill into a parliament or Congress is like throwing a single banana into a cage of monkeys. One will get it, and soon all the others are screeching. And in the United States, you see this in that, um, there's a kind of house that Jack built. You protect the car. You protect the steel and the aluminum out of which the car is made. Then you have to protect the car. But then you have to go up and down the value chain, protecting everything because you're systematically raising costs and making the whole industrial chain
Yes.
non-competitive on world markets.
Yes.
Protectionism begets protectionism. That's why it tends to collapse. And sooner or later, by the way, it begets capital controls because these inefficient industries use capital. Among the things they also use less efficiently is capital. And capital begins to look for the exits. And when countries get serious about import substitution, as many countries in the third world did in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, including some quite big countries like India, they have to have the capital controls to stop the capital from saying, we want to be on world markets earning world returns by selling world quality goods at world prices. And I worry that the logical endpoint of what Trump's trying to do, and I think this is the reason why not just stock markets, but bond markets are collapsing in the United States, is that we can all smell the coming of capital controls. Well, to tell Canadian pension plans and Canadian savers how their money must be deployed is also a form of capital control. Now, it's a nicer form. You get a certain subsidy if you use your capital the way the government wants. But we achieve prosperity by letting people make their own decisions. And Canada has been allowing that on more and more since the middle 80s, and that's been a great thing. And right now, look, understood, Canada's not doing these things willingly. It's under pressure. But there are, as we have often discussed, there are wise and smart ways of responding to the pressure, and there are foolish ways. Don't hurt yourself more because someone's trying to hurt you in the first place.
Yeah. Yeah. So much insight there. You cited Henry George. I thought you might cite the former Canadian economist who taught at the University of Chicago, Harry Johnson, who famously said of this previous bout of economic nationalism that it was tending Canada in the direction of a garbage cluttered cul-de-sac. I incidentally interviewed at an event this week a American defender of the Trump administration's tariff policy and industrial policy and all the rest from American Compass, a center right think tank in Washington that's had some influence over the administration. And one of the questions I posed to him was, what's the limiting principle?
Yeah.
That is to say, you could probably persuade a lot of people, including even yourself, that interest probably should trump markets in particular technologies. That
Yeah.
the United States may have an interest in producing, say, semiconductors. But what about T-shirts and everything
Yeah.
in between? And one gets the sense that when you hear from the Trump administration and increasingly, as you say, voices in Canada, you have various industries and various policymakers essentially making the case that every industry is
Yeah.
strategic and of a national interest, and therefore worthy of subsidies and protections and all the rest?
Well, I would agree. The industries I would be thinking about would be artillery shells. I mean, actual weapons.
Mhm.
You need your own supply of actual weapons. Although, what I would say is one of the great opportunities that the United States used to have was you can achieve many efficiencies if you're at a big country like the United States at the center of a global system of alliance with all the other, practically all the other advanced countries. You can have the best of both worlds. Before Trump, you'd say, yeah, we should make our own weapons in NATO. There should be equal competition among NATO countries. And so if a German company can make artillery shells cheaper than an American company, the contract is just as safe in Germany as it is in the United States. And um, and again, you want to probably have inside your own territory just to be extra sure, but you can have the best of all possible worlds. The thing to remember about tariff policy is, I mean, protectionists will sometimes say of free trade, it's good in theory, it doesn't work in practice. Precisely the opposite is true. It is
Mm.
protectionism that can be good in theory. There are cases where you can create. I think this is one of the things that Paul Krugman won his Nobel Prize for, was demonstrating the extremely unique blackboard conditions where a protectionism can be welfare enhancing.
Hmm.
And then you take this to Congress with interest groups or to the most corrupt administration in the history of the United States. And you say, we'd like you to execute this highly limited theoretical case where it can work, while taking enormous amount of bribes. That's not it's going to be run in the interest of interest groups in the congressional case if they write the tariff, in the interest of the bribe payer when the most corrupt administration in American history, the runner-up being Trump one. Trump two is even more corrupt than Trump one. I mean, it's just not going to work. And pretty soon you are protecting the screwdriver industry and the T-shirt industry and the tube
Yeah.
socks industry. In fact, that's what Trump has done. His tariffs on China, he's moving in the way of saying he is not going to protect the most advanced electronic goods because those are really consumer sensitive and people will be mad if they can't get their iPhones. But he is going to protect the tube stocks. And I used to argue this point with the Biden people when they said we need to bring back use COVID as an excuse to protect medical equipment. You really need to have a rubber glove industry in the United States. Wouldn't it make more sense if you're concerned about having masks and gloves during non-pandemic times, most of the time, buy a trillion of them from the cheapest provider and store them under a mountain somewhere. And then they decompose. So you turn over your inventory. So every year, as we do with the strategic oil reserve, it's not just bought in the United States. The strategic oil reserve is bought all over the world and stored in the United States. Now you can store it. You don't need to turn it over the way you did. But with your rubber gloves and your face masks, yeah, just make sure you always have a good supply under a mountain. Keep it refreshed, but buy it from the lowest bidder. Do not maintain an artificial and uneconomic rubber glove industry in the United States.
Yeah, well said. So far, David, we've talked about Trump's influence on American institutions, including this growing battle with the courts. We've talked about the administration's influence on political economy, including the extent to which it's now expressing itself in Canada. I want to wrap up by talking about his influence on the Republican Party
Yeah.
itself. A new NBC poll shows shows a considerable rise in the share of the American population in general and Republicans in particular that now call themselves MAGA supporters. This is driven in large part by a substantial increase in Republicans who self-describe as MAGA, going from 55% on election day in November to 71%
Yeah.
today. Talk about these numbers. What do you make of them?
I think Friedrich Nietzsche explained them along a century and a half ago. He has an epigram in which he says, "Memory says I did this. Pride says I cannot have done this. And after a struggle, memory yields." So I think a lot of Republicans, a lot of people cast a vote for Donald Trump in 2024, and that vote is already calamitous. We're seeing it lead to economic collapse. We're seeing it to lead to massive corruption, self-dealing. Trump has put the power to reshape the government in the hand of the single largest, or one of the largest government contractors in the United States. He's given this man power to rewrite the Securities and Exchange Commission. Well, he has cases before the Securities and Exchange Commission. It's corruption everywhere, and it's lawlessness everywhere, and it's abuse of due process and dungeons. Everything that America is supposed to stand against, it stands for. A betrayal of Ukrainian soldiers in the field, the blowing up of allies, appeasement of Russia. Um, as you become aware that that's what's happened. I mean, some people say, you know what, I made a mistake with my vote. I think enough people will say that the system will correct itself. But a lot of people say, I wasn't wrong. Everybody else was wrong. And maybe,
Hmm.
um, you know, when I voted to send people to torture dungeons without a trial, well, maybe that's a good thing, because otherwise, who am I? Maybe blowing up the world economy and all these stupid tariffs, maybe they're a good thing, because otherwise, who am I? And so, out of the need to self-justify, people end up adopting attitudes that are really pretty shameful. Uh, in the aftermath of the Second World War, the United States did a lot of opinion surveying in Germany. And one of the questions they asked gave Germans a choice between three options. Was National Socialism, the survey asked, a bad thing, a good thing, or a good thing done badly?
Hmm.
And there and there relatively few people were willing to say National Socialism was a good thing in 1946, because after all, every city in Germany had been bombed to pieces. People were hungry and destitute. Obviously, this was not a good thing.
Yes.
But uh, there were, I'm going to forget whether a good thing done badly was like the first place favorite answer, the second place favorite answer, but a considerable number of Germans insisted it was a good thing done badly, and they did that. They said that not because I think they were diehard Nazis who wanted to go back to world aggression, but because they just couldn't face what the bad thing answer said about them. If it was a bad thing, why did you support it? Well, it was a good thing. It was just a good thing done badly. I think that's what a lot of MAGA people are going to say. And maybe we're going to have to take it. Because one of the other lessons from German history was when you're trying to bring people back onto the path of democracy, a country that has gone off the path can return to democracy or can do justice, but not always both. And sometimes the return to democracy means turning a blind eye to a lot of bad actions, giving a lot of forgiveness to a lot of bad actors. And that may be the only path forward to bring the United States away from the trajectory in which it's traveling toward authoritarianism, the abolition of the rule of law, massive corruption, betrayal of alliances, and of course, this stupid and destructive trade war.
In that sense, is counterintuitively Ted Cruz, of all people, something of a canary in a coal mine? He's come out pretty strongly, uncharacteristically strongly, in fact, against the tariff in recent days. He's warned of both their economic costs and the risk that they cause a quote bloodbath for
Yeah.
Republican in the midterms. What's the significance in your mind, David, of Cruz saying this now? How should we interpret it?
It's of course welcome. I mean, Ted Cruz is a highly intelligent senator, unlike some of the others who have been more supportive of Trump. He knows exactly how catastrophic the tariffs are. And of course, he represents Texas, a major industrial state, highly integrated in the Mexican economy. He every day, I'm sure he hears from people say, you know, I'm building an office building in Dallas or Houston. The windows are supposed to come from Mexico. There's going to be a tariff on them. I don't know how much. No one knows how much. It changes, it seems, every day. How am I supposed to cancel my project? Am I supposed to pay more for the windows? If I pay more for the windows, do I raise the rent to uneconomic levels to recapture this bizarre tax? Um, so he hears from it. Um, and this may be our hope for getting out of the trade war before it does too much harm to the world economy, is enough senators bolt. Um, the power to impose tariffs at will have to be removed from Trump. That will take a vote in Congress, a vote in the House, a vote in the Senate, and then a veto override, because Trump will try to veto it.
Yes. Final question, David. Let's try to connect the dots between the issues we've discussed today. Um, the extent to which the political system starts to push back against Trump. What do you think will be the ultimate catalyst? Is it merely political self-interest of the Republican Party, or is there a chance that people are shamed into seeing what they're seeing? And I come back to this constitutional case. I don't know how familiar
Yeah.
viewers and listeners are with this particular story, but it is rather striking. The individual who's deported to El Salvador is married to an American. He has three children here in the United States. He is apprehended when he's driving with his a 5-year-old. His family now doesn't know precisely where he is, and in spite of a series of court decisions, including this statement from the Supreme Court, the administration has just ignored it. And you wonder at what point do even Republicans have to kind of see what they see.
Look, the moment of shame kicking in was January 6th, 2021. If you were able to get past that, you'll get past sending people to dungeons, even if this man who's been sent to the dungeon is dead, as he may be, that he was either died of sickness or beaten or had a heart attack. It's possible that he's not even alive. Um, you got past January 6th, 2021, you can get past anything. But Trump has the mistake he's made is not that he's underestimated the integrity of Republicans. I think he's got their measure. The mistake he's made is if you want to build an authoritarian regime, you need to deliver a lot of prosperity at the beginning. Vladimir Putin's early years in power were highly prosperous years for Russia. Viktor Orban in Hungary, I won't go into all the details of this, but he made some very important decisions that meant that during the Euro crisis of 2010, Hungary suffered less than any of its neighbors did. So that's how you get the legitimacy to then destroy the political system. And Donald Trump, in his first 3 years of his first term, by and large, kept his hands, avoided doing too many stupid things too early. And when he began doing stupid things in the bottom of 2018, they were overwhelmed by the larger catastrophe of COVID that obviated the trade decisions he was making in 2018 and 2019 and sank them in a global catastrophe that Americans generally accepted was not Trump's fault, although he made it worse, but they didn't want to believe that. This time, it's clearly he's made a series of decisions of unimaginable recklessness and foolishness. He changes his mind every day. It's spectacular. He is clearly responsible for things that I think that everyone sees are dumb, and job losses. People have lost money in the stock market. Institutions have lost money in the bond market. The mortgage rate is heading toward 8%, and it does look like job losses are going to begin to accumulate by midsummer. The American economy is very big. It doesn't show pain right away. And of course, it's protected because importers did amass big inventories of things in the first quarter of the year. So it'll be a while before the price of tube socks begins to rise as dramatically as Trump's tariffs would indicate they should. There are a lot of tube socks present in the United States. There are a lot of cases of Johnny Walker Black. There are, a lot of iPhones in inventory. But as those inventories deplete, people will pay more. And as builders in particular begin to face, my Mexican or my European windows, doors from other countries, all kinds of components, those are all costing more. There'll be a slowdown in construction. Those things are all coming, and they will soon be felt. And although Trump has a lot of ideas about how he can tamper with the integrity of the 2026 elections, those only work within limits. Trump will try to compromise the congressional elections in places like Wisconsin, places like North Carolina. He won't be able to do it in the states of New York and California, where there are Republican states at risk. Members of the House and Senate may begin to sweat that they are facing a 40-seat disaster in the House, 3 or 4 seat or more disaster in the Senate. And that will call some of them back to the path of not democracy, at least self-preservation.
A great way to wrap up a pretty wide-ranging conversation. Just again, to remind our listeners and viewers, as much as they enjoy hearing our conversations weekly, they can also hear David now twice monthly, coming out every Thursday, I believe, right, David? Every Wednesday, pardon me.
Yeah. It's every week. Every Wednesday, we drop a new one. The first was Rahm Emanuel. The second was Doug Ford. That dropped on April 16th. And we have more exciting programs coming up every Wednesday, and it's called The David Frum Show, hosted by The Atlantic.
Brilliant. I look forward to catching up with you, David, next week.
Thank you. Bye-bye.